600 people in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos went completely still. Not because of the auction, not because of the music, not because of the celebrity speeches, because a little girl in a wheelchair, a child every doctor in the country had told would never walk unassisted, had just pushed herself to her feet, trembling and pale, and was walking slowly across the marble ballroom floor, toward the janitor, not toward her billionaire mother, not toward the celebrities, not toward the cameras already turning in her direction, toward the man holding a mop. And what happened next would break every single person in that room wide open. Before we go any further, if stories like this one hit you somewhere deep, somewhere you didn't expect, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching from tonight, because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. This one is worth every minute. The chandelier above the Grand Meridian Ballroom in downtown Chicago cast light the color of warm honey across 600 people who had each paid $25,000 for a seat. The evening was called Illuminate, an annual charity gala hosted by Ashford Capital, the investment firm built over 2 decades by Evelyn Ashford, whose face had appeared on the cover of Forbes 3 separate times, and who had, at 30 years old, become one of the youngest self-made billionaires in American history. Tonight's event was meant to raise funds for pediatric rehabilitation programs across the Midwest. The irony of that, given what was about to happen, was not lost on anyone who witnessed it. Evelyn stood near the east wall of the ballroom, talking to no one in particular, holding a glass of sparkling water she hadn't touched in 40 minutes. She was wearing a navy gown that had cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments, and her hair was pinned back in a way that looked effortless and had taken 90 minutes. She looked to anyone watching like a woman completely in control of the room. She was not in control of anything. Across the ballroom, seated at a small round table near the service entrance, Ava Ashford was watching the dancers. 8 years old, dark eyes, her father's cheekbones, and her mother's stubborn jaw. She was in the motorized wheelchair she'd been using for the past 3 years, ever since the accident, though nobody in Evelyn's circle referred to it that way out loud. They said the incident. They said Ava's situation. They said anything except the actual word, because using the actual word meant accepting what the doctors had told them, which was that the nerve damage along Ava's lower spine was significant enough that independent standing was unlikely and independent walking was, in the opinion of 4 separate specialists, not a realistic goal. Ava did not know that her mother cried in the car after those appointments. Evelyn had made sure of that. The table near the service entrance was where Ava had parked herself after an hour of being introduced to adults who smiled too wide and talked to her in the slow, exaggerated voices people sometimes used with children they pitied. She hated that. She hadn't said she hated it because her mother had that look in her eyes all night. That stretched, tired look that meant Evelyn was working very hard not to fall apart. And Ava had learned sometime in the past 3 years to read that look and go quiet when she saw it. So she had wheeled herself to the table by the service entrance and she was watching the dancers, and that was where she first noticed the janitor. His name was Mason Cole, though at the time Ava didn't know that. He was tall, not dramatically so, but the kind of tall that takes up space without trying to. He wore the white uniform shirt and gray pants of the hotel's service staff, and he was working a wide mop across the far edge of the marble floor, near the corridor that led to the kitchen. He moved efficiently, without wasted motion, the way people move when they've spent a long time doing physical work, and their body has simply memorized the mechanics of it. His face was the kind of face that didn't draw attention. Not plain exactly, but quiet. Like the face of a man who had decided, at some point, to stop being noticed. He was 37. He had a son at home, 6-year-old Eli, being watched tonight by the neighbor across the hall, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Petroff, who always left a $20 bill in Eli's pocket in case Mason needed extra time. Mason had told her she didn't have to do that. She had told him, very directly, to stop arguing with her. Mason had been working at the Grand Meridian for 14 months. Before that, a hotel in Milwaukee. Before that, one in Detroit. He moved every year or so, not because he got fired. He never got fired. He was reliable in the particular way that came from military training and personal discipline, but because staying in one place too long made him uncomfortable. Eli had adapted to this without complaint, which was either a good sign or a sign that Mason had somehow already taught his 6-year-old to expect impermanence, and he tried not to think about which one it was. Nobody at the Grand Meridian knew what Mason had done before the hotels. He'd filled out the job application honestly. Employment history listed as various service roles, 2019 present, and before that, 12 years of military service. But he hadn't elaborated, and nobody had pushed. The hotel manager, a practical man named Gerald, who cared mostly about whether the marble floors met his standards, had looked at Mason's references, seen the word exceptional used twice and irreplaceable used once, and hired him on the spot. Mason had mopped floors in 3 states and learned that most people don't look at the person holding the mop. He had decided this was fine. He had decided this was, in fact, exactly what he needed. He was working near the service corridor when he felt someone watching him. He looked up. The little girl in the wheelchair at the corner table was staring at him with the direct, unself-conscious intensity that only very young children and very old people seem to manage. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't doing anything, really, except watching him the way you watch something you're trying to figure out. Mason looked back at her for a moment. Then he gave her a small nod, just acknowledgement, nothing performative, and went back to mopping. He didn't think much of it. He'd worked around events like this before. There were always a few children at these galas who'd been dragged along and were bored and would inevitably wander near the service areas where the interesting work happened, because children had better instincts than adults about where the real things were taking place. He didn't know the girl's name. He didn't know she was the host's daughter. He didn't know what she couldn't do. He just kept mopping. Ava watched him for 11 minutes. She counted, more or less, though she wasn't precise about it. She watched the way he moved, calm and unhurried, not looking up at the crowd, not caring that 600 people in expensive clothes were 20 feet away. She watched how he corrected his direction when he reached an obstacle, efficient and unbothered, and then she watched something she hadn't expected. He stopped briefly and looked at the dancers on the floor. Not the way the other staff looked at them, not with envy or irritation, but with this expression she couldn't name exactly, like he was remembering something. Then he looked away and went back to work. She made the decision in the way 8-year-olds make decisions, which is to say, she made it completely, without qualification, before she'd fully thought it through. The sensation started in her lower back. Not pain exactly, but the strange electric buzzing she sometimes felt when she pushed against the limits the doctors had described. Her physical therapist, a careful woman named Dr. Reyes, called it neuromuscular feedback and told Ava to take note of it, but not to overextend based on it. Her mother had very carefully repeated those words to Ava several times. Ava gripped the armrests of her wheelchair. The buzzing spread down through her hips. She pushed. The effort required, the sheer mechanical demand of it, was not something anyone in that ballroom would have understood just by watching. What looked from the outside like a small girl standing up was, from the inside, the equivalent of pushing against a door that had been locked for 3 years and might be locked still and might break her if she pushed wrong. Her legs shook, her arms shook, the table beside her rattled when she grabbed it, and a half-full glass of sparkling water tipped and would have fallen if a passing server hadn't caught it without breaking stride. Ava stood. Not fully upright, she was leaning slightly, one hand on the table, her balance uncertain and her legs visibly trembling. But she was up. Her feet were on the floor. She was standing in a room where 600 people were about to realize what they were looking at. The first person to notice was a woman near the adjacent table who stopped mid-sentence. Then the man beside her. Then, in the way that silence spreads through crowds, not announced, just felt, the ballroom began to go quiet in a ripple from Ava's corner outward. Evelyn heard the silence before she understood it. She turned. Her daughter was standing. The glass in Evelyn's hand would have dropped if a server hadn't appeared at her elbow and caught it. And she didn't even notice because she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except watch her 8-year-old daughter. Her daughter, who 4 specialists had cautioned against expecting too much from, take one trembling, deliberate step forward. Then another. Don't fall. Please don't fall. Evelyn thought it so hard it was almost sound. She did not walk forward. She stood frozen because she was terrified that if she moved, if she crossed the room, if she made this about her response to it rather than about Ava's choice to do it, something would break. Ava wasn't looking at her. That was the part that cut deepest, and Evelyn would think about it for months afterward. Her daughter was walking across a room full of people who were beginning to understand what they were witnessing, and she wasn't looking at any of them, not at her mother, not at the celebrities, not at the cameras that were starting to turn. She was looking at the janitor. Oh, Mason had his back to the room. He was working the far edge of the marble near the service corridor exit, and the sound of the ballroom had changed, quieter, heavier, somehow. But he'd worked enough events to know that crowds went quiet for a dozen different reasons, and none of them were his business. He kept moving. "Excuse me." The voice was small and slightly out of breath. He turned. The girl from the corner table was standing 3 feet behind him. She was leaning toward him, slightly off balance, and her legs were shaking hard enough that he could see it from where he stood. And her face was the color of someone who has done something very physically demanding and is refusing to admit it, hurt. She was standing without the wheelchair. Something in Mason's training recognized this before the rest of him did. The trembling that indicated real effort, real limit, real risk of collapse. And he went still in the practiced way of someone who knows that the wrong movement can be worse than no movement. He looked at her, steady, not alarmed. "I heard you," he said. She took a breath. "Will you dance with me, please?" The ballroom behind her had gone completely silent. Mason did not look at the crowd. He looked at the girl, at the shaking legs and the locked jaw, and the absolute determination in her dark eyes. And he made a calculation that had nothing to do with the cameras or the crowd or the billionaire standing frozen 30 feet away. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." He set the mop handle quietly against the wall. Then he walked toward her, not fast, and crouched down slightly so they were closer to eye level, and he held out both hands. Not to catch her, not to support her weight, just to offer them. "You pick the pace," he said quietly. "We go as slow as you need." She put her hands in his. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not choreographed. It was not graceful. It was not the kind of dancing that belonged in a ballroom at a $25,000 a seat charity gala. Ava shuffled more than she stepped. Her balance failed twice, once badly enough that Mason took her weight without being asked and held it until she found her feet again. And he did it without commentary, without making it into a moment, just absorbed her stumble the way a wall absorbs a lean, and then gave her back to herself when she was ready. He moved at whatever speed she moved at. He didn't lead. He didn't perform. The only thing he did that wasn't purely functional was this. At some point in those 4 minutes, when her face went tight with effort and something close to shame, when she started to look like she was about to apologize, he said, just loud enough for her to hear, "You're doing it." Not "you can do it." Not "you're almost there." "You're doing it." Present tense. Already real. Her expression changed. The ballroom erupted. Not gradually, all at once, the way 600 people can collectively break when they've been holding their breath too long. Applause. And under it something raw. The sound of people who have just witnessed something they didn't expect to be moved by and can't help themselves. Evelyn put her hand over her mouth. She was shaking. She watched her daughter standing in the middle of a marble ballroom floor, holding the hands of a janitor she'd never met, and crying with an expression that looked less like sadness and more like something cracking open that had been sealed shut for a very long time. Mason heard the applause the way you hear weather when you're inside, present but distant, someone else's concern. He kept his attention on Ava. She looked up at him. "I did it." "You did," he said. "My legs hurt." "Yeah, they're gonna." He said it like it was the most straightforward thing in the world. "Want to sit down?" She thought about it for a moment with the deliberateness of a child who has just accomplished something enormous and is not ready to let it be over. "1 more minute," she said. "Okay," Mason said. So they stood there for 1 more minute in the middle of the ballroom while 600 people applauded and cameras recorded, and Evelyn Ashford stood at the edge of it all, watching a stranger hold her daughter's hands with more steadiness than she felt capable of herself. 1 more minute. Then Ava sat down, and Mason picked up his mop. The applause was still going when Mason wheeled Ava back to her table. He didn't make a production of it. He simply retrieved the chair from where it sat near the service corridor, brought it to where Ava was standing, still holding her own weight, but visibly running low on whatever reserve she'd drawn from, and positioned it behind her without a word. She lowered herself into it with the careful, deliberate movement of someone who knows exactly how much they've spent and is accounting for every cent. Thank you, she said. Sure. He picked up the mop handle from where he'd leaned it against the wall. She watched him. You didn't clap. He looked at her. For what? When everyone was clapping, you didn't. Mason considered this. I was right there, he said. I already knew what happened. Didn't need to clap about it. Ava thought about that for a moment with the particular seriousness of a child who is deciding whether an adult's answer is honest or just clever. Apparently, she decided it was honest because she nodded and didn't push it further. He went back to work. The crowd around them had already begun returning to its own business. The way crowds do, moving on from the extraordinary back to the comfortable, though there were still clusters of people near the dance floor talking in lowered, animated voices, and several phones were still raised. Mason noticed this without reacting to it. He kept his head down and worked the far edge of the marble toward the corridor exit, and if anyone approached him in the next 20 minutes to comment on what had happened, he gave them a brief, polite acknowledgement and kept moving. He clocked out at 11:43. Took the service elevator to the ground floor, walked 4 blocks to the parking structure, sat in his car for a few minutes before starting it. He did this sometimes, sat in the dark and quiet of the car before driving, just to let the noise of whatever the night had been drain off before he went home to Eli. He didn't think about the gala, specifically. He thought about the drive. He thought about whether Mrs. Petrov's knees had been bothering her, and whether Eli had gone to bed easily or given her trouble about it. He drove home. He would not think much about the girl in the wheelchair until the next morning when everything changed. Evelyn did not sleep. She sat in the living room of the penthouse apartment she maintained for Chicago trips, a place she'd bought 4 years ago and furnished with the help of an interior designer whose invoice she'd paid without reviewing it. And she sat in the dark and replayed what she'd seen. Ava's room was down the hall. Her daughter had fallen asleep in the car on the way back, dead weight in the way children sleep after they've pushed themselves completely empty, and Evelyn had carried her in herself, declining the offer from the night security to help. She'd needed to carry her. She'd needed that specific weight in her arms. Now she sat alone and thought about a janitor who'd said, "You picked the pace," and meant it. She pulled out her phone. The video was already everywhere. She'd started seeing it in the car, notifications stacking up on her personal account as staff members forwarded it to her, and board members sent terse messages asking if she'd seen it. She had. She'd watched it 5 times already. She would watch it 3 more times before morning, each time pausing on the same moment. The instant Mason crouched down to Ava's level, held out both hands, and waited. He hadn't taken her by the arms. He hadn't moved her. He hadn't done the thing that every adult around Ava did. Reach in, correct, guide, shape. He had held out his hands and waited for her to choose. Evelyn couldn't explain exactly why that specific thing made her throat close up. She told herself it was the hour and the stress of the event and the shock of seeing Ava stand. She told herself she'd process it properly in the morning. She opened her laptop instead and started working on Q3 projections because work was the thing she knew how to do when everything else felt like standing on ice. She worked until 4 in the morning. Then she closed the laptop and sat in the dark and thought about her daughter's face when she'd said, "You're doing it," and the way Ava had looked. Not surprised, but confirmed. Like someone had told her something she'd suspected was true and had been afraid to believe. Evelyn's assistant arrived at 8 with coffee and a summary of overnight messages. "The video has 14 million views," her assistant said carefully. "I know. The board, I'll handle the board. There are also several media requests." She paused. An HR found the employee through the hotel's staffing records. "His name is Mason Cole. He's been with the Grand Meridian 14 months. Clean record, excellent performance reviews." Another pause. "That's all they found. His employment history before the hotels is listed as military service, 12 years, but there's no detail in his file." Evelyn looked at her coffee. "Get me Gerald Hawes." Gerald Hawes was the Grand Meridian's general manager. He was on the phone with her within 7 minutes, clearly anxious and clearly not sure whether he was in trouble or not. "Ms. Ashford, I want to say on behalf of the hotel that last night, Mr. Hawes, I don't have a complaint. I need to contact the employee who worked the event last night, Mason Cole." A short pause. "I see. I'd like his contact information. Well, I'm not sure I can give that out without..." "Then ask him to contact me. His choice. I'm not going to pressure anyone." She gave Gerald her direct number. Please tell him it's not about the video. Gerald said he would pass the message along. Mason called back at 9:17, which told Evelyn something. That he wasn't the kind of person who waited to see if a problem dissolved on its own. Ms. Ashford. His voice was even, unhurried. Mr. Cole, thank you for calling back. She'd planned what she was going to say, and now found it sitting awkwardly in her mind, because the directness of his voice made formality feel like a costume. I owe your daughter an apology for the attention the video is going to bring. I'm sorry about that. A short silence. Ava's okay with it. You talked to her? Before I left last night, she was awake. Evelyn hadn't known that. The information landed somewhere uncomfortable. Her 8-year-old had talked to the janitor before the car ride home, and nobody had told her. She's a good kid, Mason said. She is. Evelyn reset herself. Mr. Cole, I'd like to offer you a position, a private contract, working directly with Ava on her physical rehabilitation. The rate would be significant, and you'd have full control over the approach. We'd provide a space, any equipment you need. I appreciate that, Mason said. But no. She'd expected hesitation. She hadn't expected the answer to be already formed. Could I ask why? Because I'm not a therapist, he said. I'm a janitor who danced with your daughter. Those are different things. What you did last night. What I did last night was take her hands and let her lead. That's not a skill set you hire. That's just not making it about yourself. He said it without apology, like he was describing something obvious. She doesn't need a coach she has to perform for. She's been performing for adults her whole life. The sentence hit Evelyn somewhere she wasn't ready for. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then what does she need, she asked, and she asked it genuinely, without the edge she usually brought to questions she expected to be answered incorrectly. Mason was quiet for a beat. She needs other kids, he said, kids who are in the same situation she's in, where falling down is just something that happens and not a thing everyone holds their breath about. You know somewhere like that? Yeah, he said. Tuesday and Thursday mornings, 10 to noon. It's a community program at the Lakeview Rec Center. It's free. They take kids with all kinds of mobility limitations. He paused. No cameras, no contracts, no performance. Evelyn looked at the Chicago skyline through the penthouse window. I'll look into it. You can look into it, Mason said, or she can just show up. He said it without challenge, just a statement. The difference between those two things was the distance between Evelyn's instinct to vet and control everything and whatever Mason Cole operated by, and she felt that distance clearly. Thank you for your time, she said. Sure. A pause. She did a hard thing last night. You should tell her that. He hung up. Evelyn sat with the phone in her hand for a long time, bad. She did not send Ava to the Lakeview Rec Center. Not immediately. Instead, she did what she always did. She investigated. She had her assistant pull information on the program, its funding sources, its staff credentials, its safety record, its liability coverage. She called the director, a woman named Pat Nguyen, who'd been running adaptive movement programs for 11 years, and who answered Evelyn's 14 detailed questions with the particular patience of someone who'd dealt with anxious, wealthy parents before and had decided long ago not to take it personally. The program checked out. It checked out completely, in the way that things with nothing to hide tend to check out completely, which somehow made Evelyn more unsettled rather than less, because she was accustomed to finding something to negotiate. She did not tell Ava about the phone call. She did tell her, that evening over dinner, that she was proud of her. Ava looked up from her pasta with an expression that was not the grateful, luminous response Evelyn had imagined. It was more complicated than that. Proud of me for what? For what you did last night. Standing up? Standing up. Walking across the room, all of it. Ava considered this. She twirled pasta around her fork in the meticulous way she'd developed recently, which Evelyn suspected was a delaying tactic. The man, Mason, he said I did a hard thing. He told me that too. Ava looked up. You talked to him? This morning, I offered him a job. What kind of job? Working with you, on your physical therapy. Ava was quiet for a moment. Did he say yes? He said no. Something shifted in Ava's expression. Not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction, but somewhere between the two. Why? He said you needed something different than a private coach. What did he say I needed? Evelyn set down her fork. Other kids? Ava looked at her pasta. There's a program, Evelyn said, at a recreation center nearby. It's for for kids who have similar challenges to yours. Movement classes. He mentioned it. Is he there? I don't know, Evelyn said, which was true. She hadn't asked. Ava put a piece of pasta in her mouth and chewed it carefully. Then, can I go? The question was simple and direct, and Evelyn had 14 reasons ready. Logistics, scheduling, liability, the ongoing attention from the video, Ava's current therapy plan with Dr. Reyes, and she opened her mouth to begin working through them, and then she stopped. She's been performing for adults her whole life. I'll look at the schedule, Evelyn said. It wasn't yes, but it wasn't the careful, padded no that she usually produced when she was afraid of something. Ava heard the difference. She nodded once and went back to her pasta. Ava attended her first Tuesday session at the Lakeview Rec Center 11 days after the gala. Evelyn did not accompany her inside. This had been the negotiation. Ava had agreed to allow Evelyn's driver to bring her, and Evelyn had agreed not to come in. She sat in the car in the parking lot for the full 2 hours, her laptop open and mostly ignored, watching the rec center door. Inside, according to what Ava reported afterward, which was more than Evelyn had expected because Ava was usually sparing with details about her day, there were 9 other children ranging from 6 to 12. A boy named Darius who had a prosthetic right leg and kept doing wheelies in his chair when the instructor wasn't watching. A girl named Sophie who had cerebral palsy and a laugh that Ava described as the kind that made you start laughing even if nothing was funny. An instructor named Carol who corrected your form with the same tone she used to say, "Good morning, matter of fact, and without drama." Ava had fallen twice. She reported this with the factual precision of someone filing an incident report. The first time reaching for a balance rail that was slightly farther than she'd estimated. The second time for no clear reason, which, she said, was annoying. Did anyone make a big deal out of it? Evelyn asked. Ava thought about it. Darius said nice one the second time. Was he being mean? No, Ava said, in the tone she used when she found Evelyn's interpretation slightly exhausting. He says it to everyone when they fall, like it's just normal. Evelyn looked at her daughter. Did you like it? Ava looked out the car window at the passing street. Sophie invited me to sit with her group for the cool-down part, she said. I didn't know anyone. She came over and said there was space in her group. That was kind. She doesn't do it to be kind, Ava said. She just does it. She turned back from the window. Can I go Thursday? Yes, Evelyn said. No pause this time. Ava nodded and looked back out the window, and there was a quality to her stillness in those moments, a private, internal thing Evelyn couldn't quite reach, that was not entirely unlike the quality of Mason Cole's stillness when he'd been mopping the floor, like someone who had found a frequency they could operate on and were running at it steadily, without needing anyone else to confirm it was working. Mason Cole had not expected to see Ava Ashford again. He'd assumed the phone call with her mother was the end of it, a strange, brief intersection with a world that was not his, resolved cleanly. He'd gone back to his regular shifts at the Grand Meridian. He'd helped Eli with a school project about weather systems. He'd fixed the leaking faucet in their apartment bathroom that the building super had promised to handle for 3 weeks and clearly wasn't going to. He had, in other words, returned completely to his life, which was what he'd been doing, returning to his life, or to the version of it he'd built from what was left, for the past 4 years. So when he walked into the Lakeview Rec Center on a Tuesday morning with Eli in tow, Eli had a dentist appointment at noon, which meant Mason was covering Carol's Tuesday session as a favor while the usual assistant was out sick. He was not prepared to see the girl from the ballroom. Ava was positioned near the balance rail in the center of the main gym, talking to a girl with a bright red hair clip who was gesturing at something with her whole arm. Ava saw Mason at almost the same moment he saw her. She did not wave or call out. She just looked at him with the same direct, unself-conscious expression she'd had at the gala, and he could see her recalibrating, registering his presence without performance. Then she looked back at the girl with the red hair clip and kept listening to whatever she was saying. Eli, who was 6 and had no filter between his thoughts and his mouth, said, "Dad, that kid was in the video." "I know. She's at your work." "It's not my work. I'm just helping out today." Eli considered this distinction with the expression of a child who has decided it's not worth arguing. She's pretty. Don't tell her that, Mason said. Find somewhere to sit where you're not in the way. Eli went and sat on the bleachers and immediately took out a small notebook that he carried everywhere because he was working on what he described as a graphic novel and needed to record ideas as they occurred to him, which was always. Mason picked up Carol's session notes from the table near the door and started reading them. He ran the first 40 minutes of the session without incident. He'd assisted at the program enough times to know the rhythm of it. The warm-up movements, the balance work, the paired exercises where the kids helped each other, which was Carol's particular theory, that the assistance itself was part of the therapy. He moved around the gym, corrected grips on the parallel bars, spotted a kid named Darius, who was testing what his prosthetic could handle with the cheerful scientific curiosity of someone who has decided limitations are a research problem. He got to Ava toward the end of the balance rail rotation. She was standing at the rail, working a transfer, moving her weight from one foot to the other in a measured, deliberate sidestep. And her form was reasonable, but she was locking her knee on the right side, which was going to cause problems if it became a pattern. "Don't lock it," Mason said. She looked at him. "What?" "Right knee. You're locking it when you transfer weight. Bend it slightly, just a small flex." She tried it. The movement smoothed out immediately. She looked mildly annoyed that it worked so easily. "How'd you know that?" she asked. "Because I do the same thing." He said it without elaboration, because the full answer was that he'd been in physical rehabilitation himself twice, once after a training injury, once after something else that he didn't talk about. And the right knee locking was a reflex pattern that came from favoring old damage. But that was more than she needed to know. She took another sidestep, and another. She was steadier than she'd been at the gala, measurably. Not dramatically different, but the kind of incremental progress that didn't photograph well but meant everything in the actual doing of it. "My mom offered you a job," she said, without looking up from the rail. "Yeah." "You said no." "Yeah." "Was it the money?" He almost smiled. "It wasn't the money." "Was it because you didn't want to work for her?" "No," he said, honestly. "Your mom seems like a serious person. That's not a bad thing." Ava took another step. "She's scared all the time," Ava said. "She doesn't show it, but I can tell." A pause, the length of 2 careful steps. "She was scared last night too. At the gala, I could see it." "I know," Mason said. Ava looked up at him. "You knew she was scared?" "When you care about someone that much and they do something unexpected, it's going to look like fear from the outside. That's just how it works." Ava thought about this. "She didn't run across the room." "No," Mason said. "She didn't. I thought she would. I thought she would come running over and grab me and make me sit down. But she didn't." "No." Ava's voice was quiet. "She just watched." Mason didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. Ava was working something through and she didn't need his commentary on it. She needed to finish the thought on her own terms. She took 3 more steps along the rail, then reached the end and stopped. Her legs were tired. He could see that in the slight drop of her shoulders, the way she let the rail take a fraction more of her weight. "Good session," he said. It wasn't encouragement for its own sake. It was a report. She accepted it as such. "Thanks for the knee thing," she said. "Sure." He moved on to the next kid. Eli watched all of this from the bleachers, his graphic novel notebook open in his lap, a pencil in his hand, not writing anything. That afternoon, Mason was sitting in the waiting room of the pediatric dentist's office, watching Eli through the small window in the exam room door, when his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "This is Evelyn Ashford. Carol and Gwyn gave me your number. I want to apologize for overstepping with the contract offer. I shouldn't have led with money." He read it twice. Then, "No offense taken." A pause on her end, the kind that had typing and deleting in it. Then, "Ava came home different today. I don't have a better word for it." He thought about Ava at the balance rail, the knee correction, the unself-conscious way she'd worked through the thought about her mother watching her from across the room. Different how? Less braced, Evelyn wrote. Like she'd put something down. He understood what she meant. He'd seen it before. Not often, but enough. The moment when someone stops carrying a thing they've been carrying so long they forgot it wasn't part of them. She's going to fall a lot, he wrote back. The program works because falling is normalized. That part might be hard to watch. A longer pause this time. Then, I know, I'm working on that. He appreciated that she didn't dress it up. He was about to put the phone away when another text came through. She asked if you'd be there Thursday. He looked at the message. Eli had just appeared in the exam room window, giving a thumbs up that meant no cavities, which was the specific kind of small good news that could briefly make a difficult week feel manageable. Tell her probably, he wrote back. Depending on my shift. He put the phone in his pocket. Outside the dentist's window, Eli was still giving the thumbs up at nobody in particular, grinning with his whole face the way children do before they learn that the world expects them to dial it down. Mason watched his son through the glass for a moment. Then he went back to his phone and changed the message before he sent it. Tell her yes, he wrote. The video crossed 30 million views on a Wednesday. Mason found out the way he found out most things he didn't go looking for. Someone else told him. In this case, it was Gerald Hawes, who called him into the management office on his lunch break with the particular energy of a man who has been fielding phone calls all morning and is not sure if he's supposed to be proud or alarmed. I've had 4 television producers contact the hotel directly, Gerald said. He was a compact, organized man who kept his desk in a state of aggressive neatness, and right now he was holding a legal pad with a list of names and numbers that he kept glancing at like it was a document he hadn't agreed to sign. 2 morning shows, 1 cable news network, and a documentary production company out of New York. Mason ate a bite of his sandwich. What did you tell them? That I'd pass along the inquiry. Gerald set down the legal pad. Mason, you understand what's happening here. People saw a video. 30 million people saw a video. It's not a news cycle. That's a cultural moment. He said the phrase with the discomfort of a man who had read it somewhere and wasn't sure he was using it right. I want to support however you want to handle this, but I also need to know if this is going to affect your ability to work the regular schedule, because the Thornton conference is next week, and I'm already short too. I'll be at the Thornton conference, Mason said. I'll be at every shift I'm scheduled for. Gerald looked at him for a moment. You're not going to do any of the interviews? No. Can I ask why? Mason finished his sandwich. He thought about how to answer honestly without making Gerald feel like he was being managed. Because the thing that happened at the gala happened the way it happened because nobody was performing, he said. The second I sit down with a television crew, it becomes a performance. And the thing that was real about it stops being real. Gerald sat with this. He was not an unintelligent man, and he heard what Mason was saying. What about the girl? Ava? That's her family's decision. And the family, Evelyn Ashford, have you spoken to her? Some. Gerald looked at the list of names on his legal pad, then set it face down on the desk in a gesture that looked like a decision being made. All right, he said, I'll keep deflecting. I appreciate it. For what it's worth, Gerald said, as Mason stood to go. What you did was a good thing, the way you handled it. I've seen people do good things and immediately make them smaller by how they handled the attention afterward. He paused. You haven't done that. Mason nodded once, the way he responded to most things that were genuinely meant and didn't require words. He went back to work. What Gerald hadn't mentioned, because he didn't know, was what the media was starting to dig up. It started with a freelance journalist named Dana Croft, who had a newsletter with 40,000 subscribers and a particular skill for finding the thread in a story that everyone else had missed. She'd watched the gala video like everyone else, but unlike everyone else, she'd noticed something in the way Mason moved. The specific efficiency of it, the posture under the hotel uniform, the way he'd assessed Ava's stability in the first second without appearing to assess anything. And she'd thought, that's not a janitor's body language. That's someone trained to read a situation fast and respond without announcing it. She'd started pulling. The hotel's employee records weren't accessible to her, but the gala's event photography was. It had been posted publicly by the event's official photographer within 48 hours. And one of the images showed Mason in the background during the setup hours, badge visible, name legible. From there, the public military discharge records took 2 days. The commendations took another day after that, because they were on a database that required cross-referencing. But Dana Croft was not a person who stopped at inconvenient cross-referencing. What she found was not a janitor. What she found was a 12-year record of service with Naval Special Warfare Command, including 3 overseas deployments, a Silver Star, a commendation for a hostage recovery operation in circumstances. The records described in language so carefully neutral, it told you clearly that the circumstances had not been neutral at all. She found a record of distinguished service that ended abruptly 4 years ago, with separation listed as voluntary, and a notation that was redacted. She published on a Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, every major outlet had picked it up. The janitor who danced with the billionaire's daughter was a decorated Navy SEAL, the headlines read, with the variations that headlines always produced, some adding hero, some adding mystery. One particularly aggressive tabloid going with secret soldier in a font that suggested threat rather than admiration. The story had everything: the visual of the gala video, the emotional core of Ava's story, and now the revelation of Mason's background, which recontextualized the whole thing in the way that additional information always recontextualizes. Not changing what happened, but changing what people decided it meant. Mason found out about Dana Croft's piece the same way he'd found out about the view count. Someone told him. In this case, it was Evelyn, who called at 7:45 Friday morning while he was making Eli's breakfast. "Have you seen it?" she asked, without preamble. "No." He had his phone wedged between his shoulder and ear, spatula in hand. "Hold on." He slid Eli's eggs onto a plate and put it in front of him and pointed at it, and Eli, who had been mid-sentence about something involving his graphic novel, understood the signal and started eating. Mason moved to the hallway. "Okay, what is it?" She told him. She was precise about it, what the article said, what it had sourced, what it had gotten right, and what it had gotten wrong or incomplete. When she finished, there was a pause. "The part about why you left," she said carefully. "The article says it's unknown. It says you separated voluntarily, but there's a redacted notation. That's accurate. You don't have to tell me." "I know," Mason said. Another pause. He could hear her deciding whether to push and deciding not to. He appreciated that. "The board called me at 6 this morning," she said. 3 of them. "About me. About the association, the ongoing visibility of the situation. They use the phrase reputational adjacency, which is the kind of corporate language that means they're worried without wanting to say what they're actually worried about. Which is? That a woman in my position is spending time with an unknown quantity." She said it flatly, without inflection. "That I don't know enough about you to be making decisions about access to my family." Mason leaned against the hallway wall. In the kitchen, he could hear Eli eating his eggs with the systematic efficiency of a child who had somewhere to be. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them I'd look into it," Evelyn said, "which is what I tell them when I have no intention of doing what they're suggesting, but I need them to feel heard so I can end the meeting." He was quiet for a moment. "That's pretty sharp." "I run a multi-billion-dollar company," she said, and there was nothing boastful about it, just matter of fact. "I've been managing boards since I was 26. I know when someone is protecting the company and when they're protecting their own comfort and dressing it up as protecting the company." A pause. "I also know the difference between an unknown quantity and a person who hasn't been asked the right questions yet." "And which one am I?" "I think you know," she said. He didn't answer that directly. "The media attention is going to hit the rec center," he said. "If it hasn't already, Carol should know. I called her last night. She's prepared. She's not going to allow cameras inside." "Good." "Ava knows about the article," Evelyn said. "She saw it on my tablet this morning before I could. She's faster than I give her credit for." A pause. "She asked me if it would make you leave." Something moved through Mason's chest. Not pain exactly, but in that neighborhood. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know, that it was your decision." Her voice was careful and level. "I won't lie to her to manage her emotions. I've done that before and it doesn't work and it's not fair to her." "She asked you to call me." "She asked me to find out," Evelyn said. "I'm finding out." Mason pushed off the wall and walked back to the kitchen doorway. Eli had finished his eggs and was drawing in the graphic novel notebook, which meant he'd eaten fast on purpose to get to the drawing, which Mason filed away for later. "Tell her I'm going to be at Thursday's session," he said. "Same as always." A short silence. "She'll want to hear it from you directly." "I figured." He looked at his son drawing. "Can she call?" "Yes, I'll have her call from my phone." Another pause, softer this time. "Thank you, Mason." Don't thank me yet. The media thing is going to get worse before it gets better. I know, Evelyn said. I've had practice with worse. He didn't doubt it. Ava called at 8:15, right as Mason was clearing the breakfast dishes. It said you were a soldier, she said without hello. I was. A Navy SEAL. Yeah. I looked it up, she said, in the tone she used when she'd done research and was going to demonstrate it. It said it's one of the hardest military trainings in the world. It said most people quit. That's true. Did you ever want to quit? He considered lying. It would have been easy and forgivable. She was 8. But she had the kind of directness that made dishonesty feel like an insult. First week, he said. Yeah. Once. But you didn't. No. Why not? He thought about it. Not the practiced version, the one he'd occasionally given to people who asked in situations where a clean answer was what they wanted, but the real one. Because I looked at the guy next to me and he looked like he wanted to quit too, and I thought, if he can stay, I can stay. And then I figured he was probably thinking the same thing about me. A silence on Ava's end. He could hear her processing this in the particular way she processed things, thoroughly, without rushing. So you stayed because of him? We both stayed because of each other. Neither of us said it out loud. We just both kept going. Was he your friend? Yeah, Mason said. He was. He did not say what had happened to that friend later, and Ava, whatever she was reading in his voice, did not ask. The article said there's a part they couldn't find out, she said, about why you stopped being a soldier. Yeah, you don't have to tell me, she said, and she said it with the exact same cadence Evelyn had used an hour earlier, which was not coincidence. That was a mother's phrasing, absorbed and reproduced by a daughter, and the familiarity of it was both ordinary and quietly devastating. I know, Mason said. I'll tell you someday, when you're older. People say that and then they don't. I will, he said. I'm not big on saying things I don't mean. Another pause. Are you going to leave because of the article? No. Are you sure? Ava? He said her name the way he said Eli's name when he needed his son to listen past the noise of his own worry. I told your mom I'd be at Thursday's session. I don't change plans because other people write things about me. A quiet that felt like relief settling. Okay, she said. Okay, he said back. Eli said I was pretty, she said suddenly. Mason closed his eyes briefly. He told you that? He said it to you and I heard him, at the rec center. He's 6. He says everything he thinks. I know, Ava said, and she sounded more amused than bothered by it. I think it's kind of nice, actually. Most people think stuff and then decide not to say it. Most people learn pretty fast that saying everything you think causes problems. I guess. A pause. He's funny. He was drawing in that notebook the whole time at the rec center. He's working on a graphic novel. What's it about? I'm not entirely sure, Mason admitted. He explains it differently every time I ask. Ava laughed. A real one, short and unguarded. The kind that happened before you decided whether something was funny or not. Thursday, Mason said. Thursday, she confirmed, and hung up. The reporters arrived at the Lakeview Rec Center on a Monday. Not inside. Carol had made clear, in terms that left no room for interpretation, that no camera crew was entering her building, but outside in the parking lot and on the sidewalk across the street, with the portable setups and the handheld recorders and the particular focused patience of people who will wait as long as they have to because they're being paid to. Mason had expected this. He'd worked with people who understood media attention in the professional capacity, and the pattern was consistent. Once the story had enough elements, it developed its own momentum, and the only question was how close you let it get before you built a wall. He arrived for Thursday's session through the building's service entrance, which Carol had arranged without being asked. She'd texted him the code on Wednesday evening with the message, "Use the back." There are 6 of them out front, and they've been there since 8. He appreciated her practicality. He'd always liked people who solved problems instead of commentating on them. Ava arrived the same way, Evelyn's car pulling into the alley behind the building. Mason saw them from inside the service corridor window. The car stopping, the door opening, Ava transferring herself to the chair with the particular sequence of movements she'd developed, efficient and self-directed in the way she'd been getting more self-directed about things since she'd been coming to the sessions. Evelyn got out too. She stood beside the car looking at the back entrance of the building, and she was wearing what Mason was starting to recognize as her working clothes. Dark blazer, minimal jewelry, the version of herself she put on when she expected to need armor. He pushed open the service door. "You can wait inside," he said. Carol set up the parents' area near the gym. Evelyn looked at him. Something moved across her face, so not surprise exactly, but the particular expression of someone who has been taking care of everything for so long that an unexpected small kindness lands in an unfamiliar way. "Thank you," she said. "The press out front is going to want to comment eventually," Mason said, holding the door. "You'll want to have thought about what it is." "I have," she said. "I'm not giving them one." "That is a comment," he said. "Just the kind made by not showing up." She looked at him sideways as she walked past him into the corridor, Ava rolling ahead of them both. "You've dealt with this before." "Different version of it," he said. She didn't press on that. They walked down the corridor toward the gym, Ava already pulling ahead with the focused momentum she always had when she was close to the session. And Mason found himself walking beside Evelyn in the narrow hallway, close enough that he was aware of the specific quality of her composure, the way she held it, not naturally but deliberately, like a thing she put on in the morning and checked throughout the day. "How long have you been this prepared for everything?" he asked. She glanced at him. "Since I was about 22. "What happened at 22? "My father's company went under," she said. "Publicly. Badly. We lost most of what we had in about 4 months." She said it with the particular flatness of an old story that had been handled so many times it no longer had edges. "I finished my business degree that year, started working. Decided that the only version of the future I could tolerate was one where I controlled as many variables as possible." "And the ones you can't control?" "I'm working on those," she said. He almost said something then, something about how the variables you can't control were usually the ones that mattered most, which was the kind of thing he'd learned in circumstances he had no interest in describing in a service corridor. But the gym door was ahead of them, and Ava was already through it, and the moment passed. The session ran its usual course, with the particular organized chaos that Carol's program always produced. Kids falling and getting up, arguing about technique, helping each other with a casual ease that adults rarely managed because adults remembered too well the cost of asking for help. Ava worked the parallel bars with a girl named Kemi who had juvenile arthritis and moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who was always calculating how much a movement was going to cost. They'd been paired before and had developed the specific easy shorthand of children who've established each other's pace without needing to talk about it. Kemi didn't make a big deal of Ava's hard moments, and Ava didn't make a big deal of Kemi's, and they both got further in the session than they usually did alone. Mason moved through the room doing what he always did, watching form, catching the subtle shifts that preceded a fall, saying the necessary thing in the fewest possible words. He was aware of Evelyn in the parents' area along the near wall. She'd sat down, which he hadn't been certain she'd do. He'd half expected her to remain standing as though she might need to move quickly. And he could feel her watching not just Ava, but the room, reading it, the way a person used to analyzing situations analyzes situations even when they've promised themselves they're just there to observe. She watched Ava fall at the 40-minute mark. It was the left side, the weaker one, her foot going out on the turn from the bar, and her weight shifting wrong before she could correct it. She went down onto the mat. Carol's mats were good, thick enough to absorb impact. And the sound of it was the specific sound of a body hitting a surface that was softer than a floor but was still a fall. Mason was 4 feet away and he did not move toward her. He watched to make sure she hadn't hit her head. She hadn't. He watched her hands come down and catch herself. He watched her stay there for a second, breathing. From the parents' area, he heard Evelyn's chair scrape. He turned and looked at her. She was halfway out of her seat. Their eyes met. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Not dismissive, not harsh, just wait. And she looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was the struggle between every instinct she had and the part of her that was learning to recognize which instincts were helping and which ones weren't. She sat back down. Her hands were in her lap, and she was holding them still by force of will. He could see that. Ava, on the mat, pushed herself to sitting. She looked down at her legs. She said something to Kemi, who'd come to crouch beside her. Mason couldn't hear it from where he was. And Kemi said something back, And Ava made a face that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. And then she reached for the parallel bar and started the process of getting back up. The process took 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Mason had learned to let it take as long as it needed. When Ava was back on her feet, gripping the bar and resetting her stance, she looked toward the parents' area. She found her mother. She saw that Evelyn hadn't moved. Something shifted in Ava's face. Not the relief Evelyn might have hoped for. Not thank you for trusting me. Something quieter and more complicated. Something like the beginning of the understanding that the people who love you most are not always the ones who come running, and that restraint sometimes is its own form of faith. She turned back to the bar. She kept going. After the session, while the kids were in the cool-down circle and the parents were collecting bags and having the low-energy conversations that happened at the end of these things, Mason found Evelyn near the water station filling a paper cup she didn't appear to need. "You okay?" he asked. "No," she said, and the honesty of it was immediate and undefended, which told him she was more tired than she was being careful about. She looked at the paper cup. "Every time she falls, I have to actively fight my own body. Like there's a wire or something between me and her, and when she goes down, it pulls." "That doesn't go away," he said. She looked at him. "You have that with Eli?" "All the time. Different situations, but yeah." He leaned against the wall. "He fell off his bike last spring. Bad one. Skinned his palms pretty good, scared himself. I was 15 feet away." "What did you do?" "Told him to shake it out and get back on." She looked at him as though she was deciding how to feel about that answer. "And you just did that? Without wanting to go pick him up?" "I wanted to go pick him up," Mason said. "That's different from going." She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the room was filling with the noise of kids and parents getting ready to leave, voices layering over each other, someone's bag zipper, Carol calling instructions for next week. "You make it sound simple," Evelyn said finally. "It's not simple. It's just a decision you make over and over." He glanced toward the cool-down circle, where Ava was sitting next to Kemi, both of them doing the floor stretches. She stayed down for almost 3 minutes. She got back up herself. "You let that happen." He looked back at Evelyn. "That wasn't nothing. Don't underestimate what that cost you." Evelyn looked at him for a moment too long. The fluorescent lighting in the rec center was unflattering to everyone, and she looked tired in the specific way that only people carrying large invisible weights look tired. Not the surface exhaustion of a hard day, but the deeper kind, the kind that lives underneath the day and doesn't resolve with sleep. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "The redacted notation in your discharge records." She held his eyes. "Was it her, your wife?" The question landed differently than questions usually landed. Not because it was wrong, it wasn't, not exactly, but because it was close enough to the shape of the actual thing that it required a real answer or a real refusal, and he was tired of real refusals. "Her name was Renata," he said. "She was a civilian contractor, medical logistics. She went into a situation that wasn't supposed to be dangerous." He stopped. He wasn't going to give the whole story, not here, not with 30 people collecting their children's bags 20 feet away. "She didn't come back, and the notation is redacted because the operation has elements that are still classified." He looked at the water station. "So I left. Took Eli. Started over." Evelyn said nothing for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful in the way of someone choosing words like they're choosing between options. "How old was Eli?" 2. "He doesn't remember her. He has one photo. He carries it in his notebook." Mason looked at the far wall. "He knows her face. That's what we've got." The room was thinning out around them, families drifting toward the exit, Carol making her rounds with the specific warm efficiency she always had at session's end. Ava was still in the cool-down circle, apparently in no hurry, talking to Kemi about something with her hands in her lap, and her posture easy in the way it only got when she forgot to be self-conscious. "My husband died when Ava was 4, Evelyn said. "Car accident, the middle of a Tuesday." She paused. It was just a Tuesday. There was no reason for it to be that day. I've thought about that more than I should." "Yeah," Mason said. "I know that kind of thinking." "Does it stop?" "Not completely." He was honest about it. "But it gets less loud. You get more days between when it's the only thing you hear." She nodded slowly. Not the grateful nod of someone who's been told what they wanted to hear, but the nod of someone confirming something they'd already suspected and are still deciding whether it's enough to work with. Across the gym, Ava finally pushed herself out of the cool-down circle and started rolling toward them. And as she got closer, Mason saw that she was watching him and her mother standing together by the water station. Not with alarm, but with that particular sharp attention she brought to things she was trying to understand. "Can Ely come Thursday?" she asked when she reached them. She directed the question at Mason without preamble, the way she did most things. "He was here last time and I want to show him the balance rail thing we did." "The knee correction?" "Yeah, I want to teach him." She said it matter-of-factly, like teaching Eli a balance exercise was an obvious and logical next step. Mason looked at her. 8 years old, hair slightly flattened from the cool-down stretch, both hands on her wheels, asking to teach someone else the things she'd learned 3 weeks ago. "I'll ask him," Mason said. "He'll probably say yes. I thinks you're pretty." Ava looked at Evelyn with an expression of enormous patience. "He already told me." Evelyn looked at Mason. Mason looked at Evelyn. There was a beat that was not planned and not performed, in which both of them were simply two people looking at each other over the head of a child who had just made them both briefly, helplessly, almost smile. It passed quickly, the way those moments do. But it had been there. Outside the rec center, on the sidewalk across the street, the cameras were still waiting. The cameras were gone by the following Monday. Not because the story had died, it hadn't, not entirely, but because something larger had broken in the news cycle over the weekend. The kind of political story that pulled media attention the way gravity pulls water, and the janitor seal billionaire narrative got deprioritized in the way that every human story eventually gets deprioritized when the news machine decides something else is more urgent. Mason noticed their absence without particular feeling about it, the way you notice when a low-grade noise you've been hearing stops. The quiet was just the quiet. What didn't go away was the internet. Dana Croft's piece had been picked up widely enough that it had developed its own ecosystem of responses. Think pieces, comment threads, YouTube reaction videos, social media arguments that had very little to do with what had actually happened at the gala, and a great deal to do with what people had decided the story meant. Some of it was generous. A significant portion of it was not. The accusation that gained the most traction, because it had the most architectural appeal, the cleanest narrative shape, was the one that said Mason Cole was running a long game. That a man with his background didn't end up dancing with a billionaire's daughter by accident. That the modesty, the refusal of interviews, the declining of Evelyn's contract offer were all calculated moves in a strategy whose endgame was financial. The smarter the con, the slower it runs, someone had written, in a thread that got 40,000 likes. And this one is running very slow and very smart. Mason read this on his phone on a Tuesday morning while Eli ate breakfast, and he put the phone face down on the counter and finished making coffee. Eli looked at him. 6 years old and already able to read the particular quality of his father's stillness that meant something was wrong. "What happened?" "Nothing. Eat." "Your face does the thing." "What thing?" "The flat thing. When you're mad but you're not going to say you're mad." Mason looked at his son. "I'm not mad." "Okay," Eli said, in the tone he used when he'd decided not to argue, but also hadn't been convinced. He went back to his cereal. "Is it about Ava's mom?" "Why would it be about Ava's mom?" Eli shrugged with the elaborate casualness of a child who has thought more about something than he's letting on. "After you think I'm asleep. I talk on the phone after you're in bed. That's different." "You talk different when it's her," Eli said. Then, apparently satisfied with having said the thing he'd been saving, he put a large spoonful of cereal in his mouth and looked at the table. Mason stood at the counter with his coffee and did not examine the statement as closely as he could have. He was, by training and by the particular discipline of 4 years of solo parenting, a practical man. He handled what was in front of him. He did not borrow trouble from territory he hadn't entered yet. "Finish eating," he said. "You've got school." Evelyn had read the same threads. She'd made the mistake of reading them late at night, in bed, on her phone, which was the worst possible time and location for reading things that required clear-eyed responses. Her first instinct had been the instinct she'd been trained by 12 years of corporate life to trust. Assess, respond, neutralize. Call her PR firm. Get ahead of the narrative. Release a statement that reframed the conversation on her terms. She'd sat up until 1 in the morning drafting that statement in her head, and by 1:15 she'd decided not to release it. The reason she decided not to was not strategic. It was simpler than that. The accusations being made about Mason were wrong, and she knew they were wrong not because she'd had him investigated. She hadn't, and she was aware of how much it said about the past 3 months that she hadn't. But because she'd been in enough rooms with enough people whose motives needed watching to know the difference between calculation and character. Mason Cole was many things. Calculated about this, he was not. She called him at 7:30, before her first meeting. "I've seen the threads," she said when he picked up. "I figured. I want to release a statement about my family's relationship with you, clarifying that you've never asked for anything, that you declined compensation, that everything that's developed between our families has been—" She stopped. "I'm not going to do it without your agreement." A pause on his end. "Don't," he said, Mason, a statement from you just confirms that the story is something that needs managing. Right now, it's internet noise. You respond, it becomes a thing your PR firm responded to, which is a different and worse thing." She was quiet for a moment. "And the people who think you're running a con? People who know me know better. People who don't know me are going to believe whatever they want, regardless of what you put in a statement." His voice was flat and certain. "I've dealt with people deciding what I am before. I'll deal with it again." "It bothers me," she said, "on your behalf." "I know it does." A pause that was not unfriendly. "That's a decent impulse, but it's not your fight." "It feels like my fight." "Evelyn." He said her name the way he sometimes said it, without weight, without agenda, just direct contact. "The people saying those things don't know me, they don't know you, and they built their version of this story out of a 30-second video and a 5-paragraph article. Their version of me isn't me. Fighting it just gives it oxygen." She held the phone and looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, which was gray and low that morning, clouds sitting on the upper floors of the taller buildings. "How do you do that?" she asked. "Not fight it. Practice," he said, "and a reasonably accurate understanding of what actually matters." "What actually matters?" "Ava, Eli, the sessions, what's real." She was quiet. Outside, the clouds shifted slightly, a thin bar of early light catching the glass of the building across from hers. "I've been thinking about coming to the sessions," she said, "not just sitting in the parents' area, actually participating." A beat of silence. "There's an adult adaptive class on Friday mornings. Carol runs it. Different injuries, different reasons people are there, but the structure is the same." "I don't have a mobility limitation." "You don't need one," Mason said. "Carol takes people who want to work on something, balance, strength, movement, discipline. She'd let you in." A pause. "Question is what you're working on." Evelyn thought about the sessions she'd observed. The falling. The getting back up. The way her body had responded to Ava going down on the mat. The wire, she'd called it. The physical pull between her and her daughter that she was still learning to manage. She thought about 12 years of controlling every variable she could reach, and the exhaustion of it, the specific kind of exhaustion that didn't feel like tiredness, but like standing at the edge of something and not knowing how to step back. "Letting go," she said, "of outcomes." He didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was a degree quieter than usual. "Yeah," he said, "Carol's good at that." She showed up Friday at 9:58. Carol Nguyen was 61, 5'2", and had the energy of someone who'd decided decades ago that the appropriate response to the world's difficulty was to move through it faster. She'd been running adaptive movement programs since she was 30, first as a physical therapist, then as the founder of the Lakeview program, which she'd built from a rented gymnasium and a grant she'd written herself at her kitchen table in 1998. She'd seen every kind of person come through her doors, people with injuries, people with fear, people who were technically fine and were carrying something that functioned like an injury in every practical sense. She looked at Evelyn Ashford for about 4 seconds when she walked in. "Friday morning," and then she said, "Comfortable shoes?" Evelyn looked down at the shoes she'd specifically selected that morning. Flat, rubber soled. "Yes." "Good. We start with the floor." "The floor?" "Floor work. Core, balance, foundation, proprioception. The floor tells you things the upright position hides. Carol was already walking toward the center of the room. You're not going to be good at it the first day. That's the point. Evelyn was not good at it the first day. She was, in the specific way of someone who had been physically competent all her life without ever being seriously challenged, worse than she expected. The floor exercises Carol ran through were not complicated, but they required a quality of attention to her own body that she wasn't used to. A listening, Carol called it, without any self-consciousness about the word. And Evelyn kept anticipating the movement instead of following it, kept compensating with the wrong muscle group, kept reaching for control at the moment when the exercise required her to release it. She did not fall, but she came close 3 times. The third time, Carol said, without breaking rhythm, "Stop catching yourself." "I almost went over." "Yes, let it happen." "I'll fall." "The mat's there. Fall on the mat." Carol looked at her with the expression of someone who has explained this 1,000 times and has not stopped believing it. The catch reflex is the enemy. It fires before you know what's actually happening, and it locks you out of information your body was about to give you. Let yourself go. Find the floor. Then you know where you actually are. Evelyn looked at the mat. She let go. She went down sideways, not badly, landing on her forearm and rolling with it in a way that wasn't graceful but wasn't damaging. She lay there for a second, on her side on the mat, looking at the fluorescent lights on the gym ceiling. "Now," Carol said, crouching beside her. "Where are you?" Evelyn considered the question more seriously than it seemed to require. Her shoulder was reporting mild impact. Her hip had taken a small knock. Her breathing was slightly elevated from the adrenaline of going down. She was aware of the mat underneath her, its specific texture and give, in a way she hadn't been aware of it from standing. "On the floor," she said. "Right," Carol said. "On the floor, and you're fine. Now get up." She got up. Carol moved on without comment, and Evelyn followed, and by the end of the hour she had fallen twice more and gotten up twice more. And the getting up had gotten fractionally easier each time, not because she'd gotten stronger in an hour, but because the anticipation of it had gotten slightly less catastrophic. The falling was just falling. The floor was just the floor. She sat on the bench after class, stretching her calves and feeling something she couldn't immediately name. Not relaxed exactly. Her body had been through something, but lighter. Like a tension she'd been holding at a frequency too constant to notice had briefly turned off, and now she could hear the silence where it had been. Carol sat beside her with 2 water bottles and gave her one. "You going to come back?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "You're going to be bad at it for a while." "I know." Carol nodded, satisfied. "Your daughter's improving," she said, not as a non sequitur. Evelyn understood the connection. "You know why?" "The sessions, the other kids." "That's part of it." Carol drank from her water bottle. "The bigger part is she stopped waiting for permission to fail." She looked at Evelyn levelly. "She doesn't do that thing anymore where she checks the room before she tries something. She just tries it." A pause. "Kids catch that from adults, mostly. The waiting for permission thing. They watch the adults they love and they learn. Is failure something we talk about, or is it something we hide?" Evelyn was quiet. "You didn't fall in front of her," Carol said. It was not an accusation. "You managed everything." She could see the managing. Kids can always see the managing, even when they can't name what they're seeing. She set down her water. "When you fall in the Friday class and you come back next week and fall again and keep showing up anyway, she's going to know that, even if you don't tell her." "You think she needs to see me fail?" "I think she needs to see that failing doesn't end things." Carol stood. "You did good today, for someone who clearly hates not being good at things." Evelyn looked at her. "Is it that obvious?" "Oh, very," Carol said pleasantly, and walked away. What? Mason was at the Thursday session when Evelyn arrived for the first time, not as an observer. She'd told him she might do this, in a text the day before, not asking permission, not really, but the way she'd started communicating things to him, which was, as a fact, with a question mark attached. Something between an update and an invitation to respond. Thinking about joining the Thursday parent group Carol mentioned. Is that strange? He'd written back, "No, come." The parent group was a loose arrangement to 4 or 5 parents who Carol had gradually coaxed from the observation benches into a parallel gentle movement session on the far side of the gym, low intensity, more stretching and breathing work than anything demanding. Most of them were there because watching their children struggle without being allowed to intervene was physically stressful in a way that needed somewhere to go, and Carol had recognized this with the same practical intelligence she brought to everything. Evelyn joined without announcement, found a space at the edge of the group, and did what she was told. Mason noticed from across the gym, and then he went back to what he was doing. He was working with Ava and Eli, which had become its own particular arrangement over the past few weeks. Eli had come to Thursday sessions 3 times now, ostensibly to show Ava things from his graphic novel, and to be shown things about balance in return. And what had actually developed was something more complicated and less definable. The two of them had formed the specific lateral kind of friendship that happened between children of different ages, when neither of them had many friends, and both of them were unusual in ways that made them interesting to each other. Eli was teaching Ava about his graphic novel's main character, who was apparently a boy who could slow down time, but only when he was completely calm. Ava had questions about this that she delivered with her characteristic directness. "How does he get calm when something scary is happening?" she asked. They were sitting on the mat at the edge of the parallel bars, technically on a rest break, clearly not resting. Eli considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "He breathes," he said, "like a specific way. In for 4, out for 8. My dad taught me." "Does it work?" "Yeah." He paused. "It works better if you don't think about whether it's working while you're doing it." Ava looked at him. "That's kind of impossible." "I know," Eli said. "That's why it takes practice." He looked at his notebook. In the story, he had to practice for 2 years before he could do it fast enough to matter. 2 years is a long time. My dad says the things that take a long time are the ones that stick. Ava was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the parallel bars. "I've been at this for 3 months." "That's not 2 years," Eli pointed out. "I know." She put her hands on her wheels and looked at them. "I used to think I'd either get better or I wouldn't, and there wasn't much I could do about which one. Like it was just going to happen or not happen." She paused. "Now I think it's more like, it's happening all the time, you just can't see it from inside one day." Eli looked at her with the expression of someone who has found an idea useful. "Can I use that in the story?" "If you want." "I'll put your name in the thank you part," he said. "Graphic novels have thank you parts?" "Mine will," Eli said firmly. Mason had heard most of this from where he was standing, close enough to monitor but angled away enough to give them the privacy of thinking they weren't being listened to. He moved away now, across the gym toward the balance rail, where a new kid was working through his first session with the particular combination of bravado and terror that always accompanied the first session. He glanced toward the parent group. Evelyn was following the stretching sequence Carol was leading, and she was not good at it. He could see that from across the room, the slight overcorrection in her spine alignment, the tendency to anticipate and push rather than settle and open. But she was doing it. She wasn't observing it or supervising it or managing it. She was just in it, imperfect and present, and there was a quality to her presence in those moments that was different from every other version of her he'd seen. She looked like someone who had put something down. Not completely, not permanently, but for the length of this hour, in this gym, she had put it down. After the session, the 4 of them, Mason, Eli, Evelyn, Ava, walked out through the service entrance together because the front of the building still occasionally had a photographer who'd taken up what felt like a semi-permanent post across the street on the theory that eventually someone interesting would appear. The alley behind the rec center was unremarkable. Dumpsters, a delivery dock, the kind of back-of-building space that cities produce in vast quantities and nobody photographs. They stood there while Evelyn's driver brought the car around, and Eli sat on a concrete parking barrier drawing in his notebook, and Ava positioned her chair next to him to look at what he was drawing. "Is that me?" she asked. "Maybe," Eli said. "The character has a wheelchair." "Maybe." "In the story?" Eli looked at the drawing, then at her. "She slows down time too," he said. "But she does it different. She does it by being really still. Like she gets so still that everything around her slows down." Ava looked at the drawing. "That's not a superpower. I can do that." "That's why I'm putting it in," Eli said simply. Evelyn was standing a few feet away, close enough to hear this, and Mason was standing near her in the particular way they'd fallen into the habit of standing when they were waiting for something, side by side, not quite facing the same direction, the slight angle that was the posture of two people who had gotten comfortable enough not to perform attention at each other. "He's something," Evelyn said quietly, watching Eli. "He has his moments. He's going to be a good man." Mason looked at his son, sitting on the parking barrier with his pencil and his notebook, explaining his story to a girl in a wheelchair in a back alley on a Thursday afternoon, with the total commitment of someone for whom this was the most important work currently happening in the world. "I hope so," he said. "I'm trying to give him the right things to work with." "What are the right things?" He thought about it. "Consistency, mostly. Knowing that I'm going to be where I said I'd be. Knowing that things don't disappear just because they get hard." He paused. "Renata was the warmth. I'm more the framework. I worry sometimes it's not enough." "It's enough," Evelyn said. He looked at her. She was looking at Eli and Ava, not at him, and she said it without the deliberation of reassurance. She said it like a person reporting an observation. "You're sure about that?" he asked. "Look at him," she said. "He's creating a whole world so that the people he cares about have a place in it. Kids don't do that when they're running on empty." She paused. "They do that when they feel secure enough to give things away." Mason was quiet for a moment. The car appeared at the alley entrance. Eli looked up from his notebook, registered that leaving was imminent, and began the particular process of closing a notebook and standing up that he always performed as if he were shutting down a complex piece of equipment. "Ava," he said with great seriousness. "Next Thursday?" "Next Thursday," she confirmed. He nodded, satisfied, and climbed off the barrier. They did the small logistics of departure, car doors, goodbyes, the checking of bags for left-behind items. Just before Evelyn got into the car, she turned. "Mason," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you for what you said about the framework." She held his eyes for a moment. "I've been thinking about what mine is, the thing I'm actually building, not the company." She paused. "I'm still figuring it out." "You've got time," he said. "I'm not always convinced of that." "You're 30 years old. People always say that like it means something automatic." Her voice was direct but not harsh. "Time isn't automatic, you know that." He did. He knew it more than most people knew it, in the specific way that loss teaches you about time, not as a philosophical concept, but as a physical reality, the way a stopped clock teaches you that clocks require something active to keep moving. "Yeah," he said. "Fair." She held his eyes for one more moment, not searching, not asking, just present in the way she'd been getting more present over these weeks, less managed, more simply there. And then she got into the car. He stood in the alley and watched the car pull out. The shift came quietly, the way real shifts always do, in increments too small to photograph. Evelyn began attending the Friday adult class consistently. She fell and got up and fell again, and stopped dreading the falling in the specific way Carol had described. Not eliminating the reflex, but getting familiar enough with the floor that it lost its authority over her. She was not graceful about it. She did not become graceful about it, but she became steady in a different way. Not the steadiness of control, but the steadiness of someone who has tested the floor and knows it holds. She started staying after the Thursday children's session when she could, and what had begun as 4 people standing awkwardly in a service alley became, over weeks, something more like a weekly rhythm. The sessions, the alley, sometimes a coffee from the cart on the corner that Mason bought because Evelyn had tried twice to pay for everything, and he'd told her, with complete calm, that he was buying the coffees and she was going to let him, and she'd looked at him for a second with an expression he couldn't quite read, and then said, "Fine." They talked. Not the way people at the beginning of something talk, cautious, edited, but the way people talk when they've been paying attention to each other across weeks of shared difficult moments, and have already seen each other's less polished edges and have decided that's acceptable information to have. She told him about her father's company collapsing and the specific shame of public failure that she'd decided at 22 she would never allow herself to experience again and had been running from ever since. He told her about the last deployment. Not everything, not the classified parts, but the shape of it, the weight of what it meant to be in a role where other people's lives were the direct consequence of your decisions, and then to lose someone on a day that wasn't supposed to cost anything. She listened the way she did most things, completely, without interrupting, with the specific quality of attention that made you feel like you'd been actually heard rather than processed. He noticed this. He noticed other things too, in the way you notice things you're not actively looking for, but your attention finds anyway. The way she looked when Ava did something unexpected. Not the controlled, managed version of pride, but the real version, which was messier and more helpless, her face briefly out of her possession. The way she was, gradually, doing this more, allowing her face to be out of her possession in front of him. He didn't name it to himself. He wasn't ready to name it, and he wasn't sure she was either, and he was old enough and damaged enough to know that the distance between something is growing here and doing something about it was a distance that needed to be crossed slowly, with both people's full weight behind the crossing, so he didn't cross it. But he stopped pretending the distance wasn't there. One Thursday evening in December, after the session, after the alley, after Evelyn's car had pulled away with Ava already asleep in the back seat, Mason and Eli walked to their own car in the parking structure 2 blocks over. It was cold, properly cold, the Chicago kind that had texture and weight, and Eli had his hood up and his hands in his pockets, and they walked in the specific comfortable silence they had together when neither of them needed to fill it. Eli said, "Do you like Ava's mom?" Mason looked at the sidewalk ahead of them. "Yeah, she's a good person." "Like a friend?" "Something like that." Eli was quiet for half a block. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. "Mom would want you to have a friend," he said. He said it the way he said most things, simply as a statement of what he understood to be true, without loading it with more than it could hold. Mason looked at his son. Eli looked straight ahead, tracking the sidewalk with the focused attention of someone navigating cold pavement. "Yeah," Mason said. "She would." They walked the rest of the way to the car without talking, and Mason drove them home, and somewhere between the parking structure and their front door he accepted, quietly and without announcement, that the thing he'd been refusing to look at directly was not going to disappear if he kept not looking at it. He put Eli to bed. He sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and his phone on the table and did not text Evelyn because it was 10 at night and he wasn't ready, and some things needed to arrive in their own time. But he didn't put the phone away either. The phone stayed on the table until 11:14, when Mason finally picked it up and wrote one sentence. "Eli said something tonight that I've been thinking about." He set the phone down, looked at it, picked it up again and sent it before he could rewrite it into something more careful. The response came back in 4 minutes, which meant she was still awake, which he'd suspected. What did he say? He thought about how to write it and decided the honest version was the only version worth sending. He said his mom would want me to have a friend. He said it like it was just a fact he was reporting. A longer pause this time. He watched the screen and didn't watch the screen. "6-year-olds see things," she wrote back. "Yeah." Another pause. Then, "Mason, I don't know how to do this carefully. I've been trying to figure out the careful version for about 2 months, and I don't think there is one." He read that twice. "There isn't," he wrote. "That's been my experience. I have a daughter with a complicated medical history and a company with a board that has opinions about my personal life, and I haven't let anyone close in 4 years because close meant one more thing I could lose." She sent that, then immediately sent another. That's the honest version. I didn't edit it. "I know," he wrote. "I have a 6-year-old who carries his mother's photo in a notebook, and I move cities every year so nothing can take root. And I told myself that was practical, and it was mostly just fear." The cursor on his screen blinked. He waited. "What do we do at?" she wrote. "I don't know," he wrote back. "I think we just said it out loud. Maybe that's where you start." A pause that felt different from the previous ones. Not hesitation, but something settling, like a door that had been slightly ajar, opening another inch. "Okay," she wrote. "Okay," he wrote back. He put the phone down and sat in the kitchen for another 20 minutes, and the feeling that was in the room with him was not certainty. He'd learned enough to distrust certainty, but it was solid in a way that the past 4 years hadn't been solid, and he recognized it, from a long time ago, as the feeling of ground underfoot. January arrived with the kind of cold that made Chicago feel like a personal decision the city was making about the people who lived there. The rec center sessions continued. Carol had expanded the Thursday children's program by 2 additional slots, citing increased demand, and the gym had the particular crowded, productive noise of more kids working in a smaller space, which turned out to be fine, because kids, Carol had always maintained, did better with witnesses than without them. Ava had progressed in ways that Dr. Reyes, her original therapist, described in their quarterly check-in as meaningfully exceeding our projected trajectory, which was the clinical way of saying that what was happening was more than what they'd planned for. She could walk the parallel bars the full length without stopping. She'd begun work on the cane, a lightweight forearm crutch that Carol introduced into sessions with the same matter-of-fact energy she brought to everything. No ceremony, just here's the next thing. Let's see how it fits. She was not fast and she was not steady in any way that would look dramatic from the outside. But she was doing it every Thursday, every Tuesday. Getting up when she went down, which she still did regularly, though the going down itself had changed. She'd stopped bracing against it as though it were a catastrophe and had started treating it as information, the way Carol had taught Evelyn on the mat that first Friday, and what Evelyn had, without ever naming it as a lesson, modeled for her daughter, simply by showing up and falling and coming back. The things we teach without meaning to teach them. Mason had thought about this a lot in the months since October, about the invisible curriculum of parenthood, the things children absorb not from what you tell them, but from what you do at 11 at night when you think they're asleep, or what your face does when you get news you didn't expect, or how long you stay on the floor before you get up. Eli had learned patience from watching Mason fix things that took multiple attempts. He'd learned that sadness was a room you could leave and come back to, not a place you lived permanently, from the specific way Mason had navigated the anniversary of Renata's death every year. Quietly, but not secretly, not hidden away as though the grief were something shameful. He'd learned that the people you loved deserved the truest version of you, not the most composed version, from a conversation Mason had heard him have with Ava on the gym mat in December, when Ava had asked if he missed his mom. Yeah, Eli had said. Mostly I miss having one, like, I miss the idea of it. My dad says that's okay. He says you can miss something you didn't really have enough of. Ava had been quiet for a moment, then, I miss my dad like that too. I don't remember him very well, but I miss him all the time. My dad says grief is just love with nowhere to go, Eli said, so you have to find somewhere to put it. Mason had stood very still at the equipment rack where he'd been storing cones and listened to his 6-year-old deliver back to another child. The thing Mason had said once, quietly, on a night 2 years ago when Eli had asked why missing someone felt so heavy. He hadn't known Eli had kept it. He hadn't known it had mattered enough to keep. You never know which words are the ones that stay. The Lakeview Community Center's annual spring performance was held on the second Saturday of March. It was not a recital in the formal sense. Carol rejected the word on principle, on the grounds that recitals implied a standard of polish that had no business being applied to children who were still learning how their own bodies worked. She called it a showing. Come and see what we've been doing, her invitation read, mailed to families 3 weeks in advance, in the specific no-frills format that Carol applied to everything. It won't be perfect. It will be real. The gym was arranged with folding chairs facing the cleared center floor, and there were maybe 60 people in those chairs. Parents, siblings, a few grandparents. Mrs. Petrov from across the hall, who Mason had told about it, and who had appeared at his door that morning in her good coat asking what time they were leaving. He'd driven her. She'd sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, and told him, matter-of-factly, that Renata would have liked this version of his life, and he'd driven 3 more blocks before he'd trusted himself to respond. And he'd said, yeah, I think she would, and Mrs. Petrov had nodded and looked out the window and asked if there would be coffee. There had been coffee. Carol had set up a small table by the door. Evelyn sat in the front row, which she'd staked out early, and Mason sat 2 seats down from her with Eli between them, which was Eli's specific choice. He'd walked directly to that configuration and sat down in it, as though he'd drawn it in his notebook the night before and was now executing the plan. Mrs. Petrov sat on Mason's other side and immediately struck up a conversation with the grandmother beside her about parking. The program ran for 50 minutes, 12 children, each doing a short individual piece, and then participating in a group sequence that Carol had choreographed over 6 weeks of Thursday and Tuesday sessions, built entirely around what each child could do rather than what the form required. Darius did a sequence on his prosthetic that involved a controlled spin he'd been working on since November and landed it clean. Sophie moved through her routine with the halting, deliberate quality that her condition required and managed to make it look, against all logic, like intention rather than limitation. The new kid, A 10-year-old named Marcus, who'd joined in January after a sports injury, got through his piece without stopping, which was the whole of what he'd set out to do, and he was grinning so hard at the end that his grandmother in the third row started crying. Ava was last. She'd asked to be last. Carol had agreed without making a thing of it, had simply written her name at the bottom of the list and moved on. But Mason had noticed, and he understood what it meant, which was that Ava had decided she wanted the full weight of the room behind her when she did what she was going to do, and she wanted to do it when there was nothing coming after her that she had to make space for. She'd thought this through. She'd been thinking it through since January, probably, in the way she thought through things that mattered to her. Quietly, completely, alone. The music for her piece was something Carol had found, a piece of instrumental piano that moved slowly and had enough space in it to accommodate whatever Ava needed to do, whatever speed she needed to go. No words, just the music and what Ava chose to do with it. She came out from the edge of the performance space with the forearm crutch in her right hand. She was not in the wheelchair. The wheelchair was pushed to the side of the gym, and Ava was walking, upright, her weight partly on the crutch and partly on her own legs. And the room went quiet in a way that was different from the polite attentiveness it had maintained for the previous 11 performers. This was a held-breath quiet. The kind that happens when a room collectively understands it is witnessing something that is costing someone something real. She moved to the center of the floor. Her legs were not steady. That needed to be said, because the story of this moment was not the story of a girl who had been miraculously healed and now moved without difficulty. Her left side still compensated. Her right knee still had the tendency to lock that Mason had corrected months ago at the balance rail, and that she still had to consciously override. The crutch took a portion of her weight that her legs were not yet ready to carry. None of that had disappeared. The doctors had been accurate about the damage. Accurate wasn't the same as final, but it was still accurate, and Ava was not performing a miracle. She was performing something harder than a miracle. She was performing the truth of where she actually was. She moved through the music at her own pace. It was not choreography in any conventional sense. It was closer to what Mason had done with her at the gala, which was follow her lead, let her set the speed, don't make it about anything other than what it actually is. Carol had worked with her on a sequence of movements that stayed within what Ava could do on her best day, so that on a day that was slightly less than her best, she had margin. She'd use that margin tonight. The movements were smaller than they'd been in rehearsal, more careful, but they were hers, and they were real, and they were being done in front of 60 people without apology. At one point she stopped. Not because she had to, not because she was going to fall or needed to rest, or had lost her place. She stopped because the music had a long, open measure, and she stood in the middle of it and was still, and for about 4 seconds the whole room was still with her. Then she kept going. At the end of the piece, she reached the edge of the performance space and stopped with the crutch planted and her chin up and her legs trembling faintly from the effort of the past 4 minutes, and the room came apart. The applause was loud enough that Mason felt it in his chest, the way you feel loud sound in a confined space, physical and sudden. Eli was on his feet immediately. He'd started to stand before the piece was even fully over, and Mason had put a hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "Wait." And Eli had waited. And now he was up and clapping with his whole body in the way 6-year-olds clap when they're not performing their approval, but simply releasing it. Mrs. Petrov was crying with the practical efficiency of someone who cries regularly and has no quarrel with it. Mason stood. He clapped. He did not whoop or call out. That wasn't him. But he stood and put his hands together steadily and watched Ava in the center of the floor. She was looking at him. Not at the crowd, not at Carol, not at the other kids lined up at the edge of the performance space. She was looking at Mason, and her expression was not the luminous, tearful resolution of a story that has arrived at its planned destination. She looked tired and relieved and slightly astonished, like someone who has bet everything on a single outcome and found it went her way and can't quite believe the math added up. He nodded at her, the same nod he'd given her at the corner table at the gala. Just acknowledgement, nothing performative. "I see you. I know what that cost." She nodded back. Then she looked at Evelyn. Evelyn was in the front row with her hand pressed to her mouth and tears moving down her face in the specific way of someone who has been holding them for the full 4 minutes and has finally run out of places to hold them. She was not composed. Her face was completely out of her possession, and she wasn't trying to recover it, wasn't reaching for the controlled version of herself. She was just there, in the front row, broken open by her daughter in the best possible way. Ava watched her mother's face for a moment. Then she made her way across the performance space, slowly, the crutch steady, the room still applauding. And she stopped in front of Evelyn's chair. She shifted the crutch to her left hand. She held out her right hand. Evelyn took it. And Ava, standing on legs that the doctors had said were unlikely to support her, gripping a forearm crutch and her mother's hand simultaneously, said something that Mason couldn't hear over the applause. He saw her lips move. He saw Evelyn's face change again, change past tears into something that didn't have a simple name, something in the territory of "this is what I was afraid to hope for." He found out later what she'd said. Evelyn told him that evening in the parking lot after everyone had filtered out and the chairs had been folded and Carol had turned off the gym lights and Mrs. Petrov had been collected by her nephew, who'd driven her home. The four of them, Mason, Evelyn, Ava, Eli, stood by the cars in the cool March air, and Evelyn said, "She told me she wasn't scared anymore," and her voice was steady by then, but just barely. Mason looked at Ava, who was in the wheelchair now. She'd been on her feet long enough, and she knew her limits with the same practical intelligence she brought to everything. And Ava looked back at him. "I wasn't scared," she confirmed, matter-of-factly. "I mean, I was a little, but not the bad kind." "What's the difference?" Eli asked. Ava thought about it. "The bad kind is when you're scared and you think the scared is right, like your body knows something bad is going to happen." She adjusted her grip on the wheels. "The other kind is when you're scared but you go anyway because you know the scared is just noise. It's not information." Eli looked at Mason. "Did you teach her that?" "She taught herself that," Mason said. Ava shook her head slightly. "You taught me the difference," she said to Mason directly. "You just didn't say it in those words." He didn't argue with that. It was probably true. They went for dinner after, the four of them, plus Mrs. Petrov's nephew, who hadn't been expected to join, but who Eli had invited with the open-handed generosity he brought to most situations, and who turned out to be a quiet, good-humored man named Frank, who taught high school chemistry and spent the meal answering Eli's detailed questions about combustion with genuine patience. It was the kind of dinner that happened without being planned, the kind that started as a practical matter and became something else, became the specific ordinary miracle of four people and a rotating cast of extras sitting around a table, eating unremarkable food, and finding, in the small mechanics of passing the bread, and arguing about who got the last of the fries, and Eli drawing a diagram of combustion on a napkin, that they were easy together. Not performed easy, genuinely easy. The way people are easy when they've already seen each other at the hard parts and decided to stay anyway. Evelyn and Mason were the last ones at the table. Eventually, Eli had gone to sit with Ava in the restaurant's corner booth to discuss the performance, and Frank and Mrs. Petrov's nephew had found some shared interest in vintage cars that had taken them to a separate conversation. And they were easy in the specific way of two people who have said the true things and are now simply in the same space without needing the true things to fill it. "I've been thinking about something," Evelyn said. "Okay." "The foundation." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I've been thinking about building something, not just funding existing programs, actually building. Something that does what Carol's program does, but bigger. More cities. With proper resources behind it." She paused. "Adaptive movement programs for kids who can't access what Ava's been able to access. Because most of them can't. What we found was luck and geography." Mason looked at his coffee. "Carol would need to be involved. Her model is specific." "I know, I've already talked to her." "You have?" "She said she'd consider it if the program kept her methodology and she had final say over curriculum." Evelyn looked at him. "She also said I should ask you." He looked up. "To do what?" "To run the physical program. Not administration. You'd want to kill yourself in a week trying to do administration. But the actual work. Training instructors. Building the physical methodology. Being the person who knows what Carol knows about how bodies learn." She held his eyes. "You'd need to leave the hotel." He was quiet for a moment. "I know that's not a small thing," she said. "You built something stable there. The schedule works for Eli. I'm not asking you to—" "Evelyn," she stopped. "I'm not going to turn it down," he said. A pause. "Just like that?" Not just like that. He set down his cup. I've been cleaning floors for 4 years because I needed to be invisible, and I needed something I could do with my hands, and I needed to be in a place where the consequences of my decisions were limited to whether the marble was clean. He looked at the table. I needed that for a while. I don't need it anymore. He looked up at her. I've been watching Carol's kids for 6 months. I know what that work does. I know what it's worth. A pause. I know what it would have been worth to Eli if I'd found something like it earlier. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. There's something else, she said. Okay. The foundation will need a name. She said it carefully. I want to name it after Renata, if you'd allow that. The word allow landed strangely. Not because it was the wrong word, but because the weight she put on it was real. The genuine understanding that this was his to give or not give, not hers to take. He sat with it for a moment. Renata had been a woman who'd spent her professional life making sure medical resources got to places that needed them. Who'd gone into a situation she knew carried risk because she'd decided the risk was worth the work. Who'd left behind a son who carried her photo in a notebook everywhere he went, and had somehow, without remembering her face, absorbed the specific quality of her warmth, and was right now in a corner booth, explaining his graphic novel to a girl in a wheelchair with the total committed generosity of someone who gives because giving is just what you do. Yeah, Mason said. I'd allow that. Evelyn nodded once. She didn't make anything more of it than it was. He appreciated that. What happened in the months that followed was not a transformation in the cinematic sense. No montage, no sudden arrival at a better life. It was slower and messier and more ordinary than that, which was the only way real things ever actually happened. Mason gave Gerald Hawes 3 weeks' notice, which Gerald accepted with genuine regret and a handshake that went on slightly longer than handshakes usually did. He spent those 3 weeks training his replacement on the standards he'd maintained at the Grand Meridian, the marble floors, the specific rhythm of the service schedule, the way to manage the overnight transition between events without leaving evidence of the seam. He did it carefully, because the work had been real even when it had been hiding, and he didn't know how to do something without doing it fully. He started at the foundation in April. The formal structure was still being built, Evelyn's legal team and Carol's requirements, and the unglamorous machinery of nonprofit formation, but the actual work started before the paperwork was finished, because that was how real things worked. He and Carol met twice a week to translate what she'd built at Lakeview into something that could be taught to other instructors, which was harder than it sounded because the most important things Carol did were things she did instinctively and had never had to describe in language. They spent 3 sessions just trying to articulate what let them lead meant in practice, what it looked like in the body, what the instructor's role actually was in the moment when a child was going to fall, and every instinct said catch them. It's not catching, and it's not abandoning, Carol said, at the whiteboard they'd set up in the rec center's back office. It's staying close enough that they know you're there, but not so close that they can't feel the space between you. That's not a curriculum note, Mason said. That's a philosophy. Then write it down as a philosophy, Carol said, and build the curriculum around it. He wrote it down. Eli finished his graphic novel in May. It was 43 pages, hand-drawn in pencil on good paper that Evelyn had bought him after he'd mentioned once that he kept running out, and which had appeared at their apartment door in a box without ceremony or acknowledgement, which was the way Evelyn did things when she wanted to do them without making Mason feel managed by them. He'd registered the box and registered what it meant, and had said nothing, because some things worked best as a quiet understanding between 2 people who were both still learning to receive things gracefully. The graphic novel was dedicated, in Eli's careful block letters, to Ava, who taught me about being still, and my dad, who taught me about showing up, and my mom, who I'm going to find out more about when I'm older. Mason read the dedication twice, alone in the kitchen after Eli was in bed, and sat with it for a while. Then he texted Evelyn a photo of the page. She responded with a single line, "He is the best thing." "Yeah," Mason wrote back, "he really is." The Renata Cole Foundation held its first program in September, not in Chicago, but in Detroit, where the need was documented, and a rec center had offered its space, and 3 of Carol's trained instructors were ready to begin. The launch was not attended by press, which was Evelyn's decision and one she made without regret. There had been enough press. There had been enough of the story told in the language of spectacle. What the foundation was going to be was not a spectacle. It was going to be a Tuesday morning in a gym in Detroit, where a kid who'd been told what he couldn't do would fall on a mat and get back up and find out that the room was still there, unchanged, still holding, and that the falling had not ended anything. That was the whole of it. That was enough. Mason was there for the first day. He stood at the back of the gymnasium and watched Carol's lead instructor, a woman named Diane, who'd been through Carol's training for 3 months and had the specific quality of attention that told you she'd understood what she was being taught, run the warm-up sequence with 9 kids who didn't know each other yet and were sizing each other up with the complicated social calculus of children in a new situation. By the end of the hour, 2 of them were arguing cheerfully about the right way to do a transfer. A girl in the back had helped a boy she'd never met find his balance on the rail without being asked. Someone had fallen, and someone else had said, without thinking about it, "You good?" And the kid on the floor had said, "Yeah," and gotten up, and they'd both moved on. It was, in every measurable sense, ordinary. Mason drove back to Chicago that afternoon. Evelyn met him at the rec center for the Thursday session. She still came to the Thursday sessions. She'd missed 3 in a year for travel and had rescheduled the travel twice to avoid a 4th. And after the session, they stood in the alley in the September air, which was cool and carried the specific quality of approaching fall. And Ava and Eli were ahead of them moving toward the cars, Ava on the forearm crutch and Eli beside her matching her pace with the unconscious consideration he'd developed over months of being near her, and Mason and Evelyn were behind them, walking close enough that their arms were almost touching. "How was Detroit?" she asked. "Good," he said. "Real." She nodded. She knew what he meant by real. She'd been in enough rooms with him by now to know his vocabulary, the specific words he chose, and what they were standing in for when he used them. They walked in quiet for a moment. Ahead of them, Eli said something that made Ava laugh. The real one, the unguarded one that happened before she decided it was funny. And Mason watched his son's face in the moment after, the particular satisfaction of a person who has made someone they care about laugh and is doing their best not to look like they know it worked. "I talked to Dr. Reyes this week," Evelyn said. "How's Ava's trajectory?" She used the word exceptional again. A pause. She said she'd like to write about Ava's progress. For a medical journal. She asked permission. "What did you say?" "I said I'd ask Ava." She looked at him. Ava said yes. She said if it helps another doctor help another kid, then why would she say no? She was quiet for a moment. "She's 8. 9 next month," Mason said. 9 next month. And she's already thinking about the kid she doesn't know yet, who might benefit from something she went through. Evelyn shook her head slightly. Not dismissal, the opposite of that. Wonder, without the performance of it. "I spent 12 years building a company, and I'm not sure I ever thought that naturally about anyone outside my immediate circle." "You're thinking about it now," he said. "The foundation." "The foundation. Detroit. What comes after Detroit?" He looked at her sideways. "That's not nothing." "It's because of Ava," she said. "And Carol. And you." "It's because of you," he said. "We gave you material. You decided what to build." She was quiet for a moment, looking at Ava and Eli ahead of them. The alley opened onto the side street, and the 4 of them emerged into the early evening light, and the city was doing what cities did in September, going amber at the edges, the light lower and warmer, shadows longer. And it was not a beautiful moment in the way that scripted moments were beautiful. It was just real. The 4 of them on a side street, 2 kids. 2 people who had arrived at each other through loss and stubbornness and the slow, uncomfortable work of deciding to stop hiding. Mason stopped walking. Evelyn stopped beside him. Ahead of them, Eli had taken Ava's free hand to help her navigate a crack in the sidewalk, and she'd let him, and they were talking about something that required Eli's hands to gesture while his other hand held hers, which meant he was gesturing with the hand that wasn't holding hers, and Ava was slightly listing with the motion of it, and they were both laughing. "I need to tell you something," Mason said. Evelyn looked at him. He'd had the version of this that was careful and arrived at from a distance, and he'd had the version that was hedged with all the reasonable qualifications. The complexity, the history, the things that could go wrong, the ways in which 2 damaged people getting this wrong would have consequences beyond themselves. He'd carried both versions for a while. He decided on the way back from Detroit that the careful version wasn't honest enough for someone who'd sat on a rec center floor and learned to fall. I don't want to be careful about this anymore, he said. About us. I've been careful about it for months because careful seemed like the right way to protect everyone, and I think careful has run its course. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Not the managed look. The real one, with the tired under it and the steadiness above it, and beneath both of those, the particular quality of a person who has been waiting for something to be said clearly so she doesn't have to pretend she hasn't been waiting. I've been waiting for you to say that since December, she said. I know, he said. I'm sorry it took this long. Don't be, she said. You needed to be sure. I'm sure. I know, she said. And she reached out and took his arm. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just the simple, direct physical fact of it, her hand on his arm, two people on a sidewalk deciding together to stop standing at the edge of something. And they walked toward the kids. There was no single moment when the four of them became a family. That was not how families were made, in Mason's experience. They were made the way everything real was made, incrementally, imperfectly, through the accumulation of ordinary choices, through showing up and staying, through the particular discipline of being present even when present was hard. They were made through Eli teaching Ava the breathing technique, in for 4, out for 8, on a Thursday mat, and Ava using it in her own way and passing it to other kids at the center who used it in their own ways. They were made through Evelyn learning to let a morning go wrong without trying to correct it back to the plan. Through Mason learning that allowing someone in did not mean holding less, that you could love someone and still be whole, that love was not always a subtraction. Through Ava discovering that the people in her life were not going to disappear if she needed them. Through Eli, who had known from the beginning what the rest of them were still learning, carrying his mother's photograph in his notebook and drawing his family and the pages around it with the exact confidence of someone who knows what home looks like and is simply recording it. There was a Sunday in November, a year and some weeks after the gala, when the four of them were in the apartment that had stopped being only Mason and Eli's in the gradual, undramatic way that spaces change. And Ava was on the couch, with her legs stretched out, and Eli was on the floor with the graphic novel's second volume, and Mason was making something in the kitchen that required more attention than he was giving it, and Evelyn was at the table with her laptop not working on whatever she'd opened the laptop to work on. And the apartment had the particular quality of a space containing people who had nowhere else they needed to be. Eli looked up from his notebook. He looked at Ava, then at his father in the kitchen, then at Evelyn at the table. He said, to no one specifically, "This is my favorite." Nobody asked him what he meant. They all knew what he meant. Mason looked at him from the kitchen doorway. His son, 7 years old now, sitting on the floor of an apartment that had finally stopped feeling temporary, surrounded by people who had arrived in their lives through grief and accident and the specific grace of a little girl who had decided one October night that the person she wanted to dance with was the one nobody else was looking at. He thought about Renata. He thought about her the way he'd been learning to think about her, not with the weight of what was lost, but with the specific and real gratitude of what had been given and what it had made possible, and the way her son carried her forward in everything he was. He thought about a 43-page graphic novel with a dedication that said, "I'm going to find out more about you when I'm older," and about how that was not tragedy, but promise. I thought about what it meant to build something from what you had left, and how the thing you built from the pieces was never the same as the thing before, and how that was not a consolation but a truth. That different was not lesser, that the rebuilt version had its own structural integrity, its own particular strength in the places where it had been remade. He looked at Evelyn, who had looked up from the laptop and was watching Eli with an expression that was the furthest thing from the controlled, managed face she'd worn at the gala a year ago. She looked like someone who had put down a very heavy thing and was still getting used to the lightness. She felt him looking. She glanced over. He didn't say anything, neither did she. Some things had gotten past the point of needing words, and this was one of them. In the living room, Ava reached over from the couch and flicked Eli's notebook with one finger. "Read me what you wrote today," she said. Eli looked up, deeply pleased to be asked. "Okay, but it's a long part." "I have time," Ava said. And she did. They all did. Time. That thing that loss had taught them not to take for granted. They had it, and they were using it, not saving it for when things were simpler or cleaner or more certain. Right now, in this apartment, with the November dark outside the window and something burning slightly in the kitchen that Mason moved to correct without drama, with a child reading aloud from a handmade book, and another child listening with her full attention, and two adults watching from their separate corners of a room that held all of it, right now was not a step towards something better. Right now was the thing itself.